On behalf of Crosscheck Media and Biz Talk Today TV, welcome everyone to the Money Path. I am your host, Todd Schoenberger. Joining me today is Shana Sissel. She is the CEO and founder of Banrion Capital Management. Shana, everyone knows you as the queen of alternatives, but you're also an expert in the business of sports. And just recently, JP Morgan released some data showing that 20% of billionaire family offices are now invested and have a controlling interest in sports franchises. Why do you think the ultra wealthy are shifting from the prestige or trophy assets such as art and cars into controlling sports teams?
Well, I think it's still a vanity asset. It's still an asset like art or such. I think the potential return opportunities are much higher, and the ability to be at a higher profile is also higher, right? You have a really great art piece and it's in your house. Nobody knows that. So from an ego perspective, like that's really just, the people who come visit. But when you own a sports team, that means you're being asked questions in the media. That means that, people are well aware and you get to make decisions as it relates to the outcomes for those sport teams. And then again, it's an asset that is scarce, right? So, having that asset and then at any point in the future wanting to sell that asset, the scarcity aspect of it really does drive that. And then there's also the competitiveness. Most people who have, acquire assets in the billions, we can talk about people who are born into wealth, but most born in wealth doesn't stay multiple generations. Billionaires and people who acquire wealth of that nature tend to be built through entrepreneurship, through business, through things of that nature. And sports kind of drives that competitive aspect that got them to be successful in the meantime.
So what you're saying is that these sports franchises, they are considered more prestige rather than a serious business asset, or do you think there is some profitability that can be had by investing in these programs?
Oh, it's an absolutely a profitable entity. I wouldn't even consider it a non-serious business. It's actually a quite serious business. It definitely is as complicated, if not more so than all traditional businesses. I hardly would suggest that it's not a business or a serious one. My undergraduate degrees in sport management, I would challenge you to the fact that there's a reason why sports management is its own major, because it is a complex business entity. But I will say that the business of sports has some prestige associated with it. And, when you think about art and collectibles and antiques and the like, a lot of the investment or purchases of those items is vanity related, right? Rarity, the opportunity to potentially sell a very rare item in the future. But, there's no guarantee of the value of those assets going up. The value of those assets is based on the scarcity of those assets. But sports teams, you actually do generate revenue, right? An art piece does not generate revenue. A sports team does. There's also prestige associated with it. There's the profile and the visibility associated with it. And just again, a lot of folks who acquire and amass wealth to the extent that it's in the billions do so because they're very good business operators. And there's actual research that shows that professional athletes or people who are athletic or competed in sports in their youth tend to be more successful in business environments. The reasoning behind it, I'm not in the weeds that much. I know it's very specific with female athletes, but it would make sense, right? Because to win and amass that kind of wealth, you have to have a competitive streak, and sports also feed into that.
Yeah, that's well said. So, according to S&P Global, they actually have computed up to $6 billion annually are being spent on quote sports services. So,
Mhm.
promoters, vendors, teams as well, agents. What structural changes do you see though in sports that will make investing in this way more attractive to the private equity world?
So, I had the great fortune of last summer 24, to have lunch with Mark Lazary, who's the former owner of the Milwaukee Bucks. And I've also had the great fortune of being able to pick the brain of some of the Reintendorf family who own the Bulls and just sold the White Sox, I believe. But my read is that these are businesses that need to be managed in a way because the value of these assets is based on media rights and licensing, right? So media rights are somewhat controlled by the leagues, but licensing is definitely controlled by success. But there's limitations to how these businesses can be run that's a little different than a traditional business, particularly as it stands with debt related to, you cannot use debt to pay salaries, you cannot use debt to acquire sports teams. But the opportunity, and I think, growing up in Boston, I saw this firsthand. I don't necessarily think the Fenway Group was the first to do this, but I think they were the most visible and successful. And then Robert Kraft obviously also did this, but was to begin to monetize the area surrounding to ensure that they're generating revenue from other sources when the season's not in session. And I think the Cowboys have done this successfully as well. Tours of the stadiums, owning the real estate around it, owning the hotel franchises that people go to, offering, game day experiences, offering additional levels of um, um, participation that people can take on. At Fenway in 1999, 2000, I was working for the New England Sports Network. And at that time, Nesson was located inside Fenway. And that was exactly the time where they decided that they were going to create a game day experience at Fenway, where they shut down Yawkey Way and Lansdowne Street on game day, so you could no longer have transportation. That didn't happen before, but by doing that, they allowed to have outside vendors. It meant to even be near the park on game day, you had to have a ticket. And then once you got in, you could participate in the vendors. There was lots of street vendors. All the bars and restaurants associated with that, were able to monetize that. Then they started building hotels around Fenway that didn't exist before. And now I live in Chicago and I've watched, when Theo came over and he obviously learned from the Fenway Group.
Yes.
That's when they
Theo
started to do
Epstein,
the
ladies and
same.
gentlemen.
Yes, Theo Epstein. That's when they started to do the same thing around Wrigley. So when I moved here, that was the first kind of beginning of the Gallagher's Way thing. There weren't a lot of hotels. Now there are tons of hotels around Wrigley that were built up since I've moved here in the last 10 years. And those things are often owned and participated in by the teams. They own their networks. Fenway and Nesson, the company I worked for in 1999, was owned by the Bruins and the Red Sox. That was a co-investment between those two teams. That was before the Yes Network. Nesson's been around forever, but the Yes Network hasn't. All these, marquee sports here in Chicago, these are networks owned by the teams. Again, controlling the media rights, controlling the licensing, controlling all of that. Those are ways to have profitability. Those are ways you can also use debt to, leverage up your investment. And then now we're talking about they're not just owning a sports franchise. So Fenway Group's a great example. They own the Red Sox, but they also have purchased a premier soccer team. And so now it's more of a conglomerate. If you look at Robert Kraft, he did the same thing once they tore down the old Foxborough Stadium and built Gillette. Now, if you go to Gillette, it's a mall. And
Yeah.
the Patriots and Robert Kraft own all of the land and own all of that property. So they do the leases and they benefit from all of that. And they've created, Fenway has tours. The Cowboy Stadium has tours. Again, monetization of the asset beyond just what you see on the field.
Right. So could you ever see or envision an opportunity for a private equity firm to get involved with a collegiate sports team? And what I mean by that would be, say, on the NIL level, where they're actually taking part and getting a cut of those media rights, such as maybe a private equity firm investing in the University of Iowa football team.
So they would never be able to do that unless it was a Notre Dame situation. Um, and I don't say that to be, kind of like obnoxious. I mean, my brother's a Notre Dame fan, and we all we all have opinions. Either you're a Notre Dame fan and all in, or you hate Notre Dame. Those are the
Right.
two options. But Notre Dame has been an independent school able to negotiate their own rights for media and other things forever. Like they were the premier program. They stayed independent because it was not in their best interest early on to ever join a conference for football because the brand of Notre Dame was bigger than, any le- uh, any um, any individual SEC conference
Mhm.
affiliation. And they would always be kind of, in a way, subsidizing a conference because that they would be the driver of any media rights. So they've stayed independent. So a private equity firm could potentially invest in like a Notre Dame because they're independent. But you couldn't actually do it on the individual school levels if there's a conference affiliation. Because much like an NFL team cannot negotiate its own media rights with Fox or whatever. It's done on the league level. It's the same thing on the conference level. So the only way that a private equity firm could invest directly in a university is if they were independent and had the rights to negotiate their own media rights, licensing rights, whatever. If they're part of a conference, just like if they're part of the NFL or the NBA, those negotiations are done on the league or conference level. So the private equity can invest in the conference, and they have, but they can't necessarily invest on the school level unless, of course, it's a situation like Notre Dame.
Right. Okay, that's understandable. So, but what about on the baseball level, though? You said you had experience at Nesson. What happens there? The Orioles have Masson. I mean, what a lot of Yes Network with the Yankees. Could a private equity firm then take part in some of those media rights?
So that is controlled by the team, and the private equity would invest in the team, not necessarily the network. I mean, that would be on the team level to make that decision. So that's a team asset, and so it's associated with the team. That's a little different than on the college level. Colleges don't own their own networks, they don't do their own licensing negotiations per se. It's done on the conference level. But on the league level, the league controls media. Really, that's it. The licensing of the individual brands themselves and any assets belonging to the team or the ownership of the team. Because many times, yes, network's associated with the Yankees, but it's not the Yankees that own it. It's the owners of the Yankees that own it. It's
Okay.
in the case of, say, Nesson, and I don't know the structure of Nesson as it stands today, but just for hypothetical situation, it's not the Red Sox that owned Nesson. It was the Fenway Group that owned Nesson
Mm,
and the Red Sox. Do you see what I'm saying?
I
So
do.
the private equity team would invest potentially in the team, and then they'd get the benefits of that. Or I'm assuming there's some way to invest directly in the conglomerate that owns all the assets underneath it.
What's more valuable in your opinion, the naming rights of a pro football stadium or a private equity interest in a sports franchise?
The private equity interest in the pros franchise. To be clear, if you own the naming rights in the stadium, you just own the naming rights. You don't own any profit that comes from the stadium. You're paying for the right to have your name mentioned every time they talk about the stadium. It's a
Right.
marketing ploy, right? It's Gillette Stadium. So Gillette gets mentioned every time and then they can do an ad and they can associate themselves. But Gillette does not get any beneficial interest of any of the revenue that comes necessarily from the stadium. Now, could they negotiate that? I don't know the specifics of how that naming right came to be, but in most cases, naming rights of the stadium, you're not paying for an investment in anything you're just paying for the rights to have your name mentioned repeatedly over and over and over again every single time they mention the stadium. And from a marketing perspective, that's just brand recognition more than anything else. But it's not
Right.
necessarily a profitable endeavor beyond that. So you would absolutely want, the ownership in the team or the conglomerate that owns the team and its assets.
And unless you look at the ad value, or maybe there's a some type of an agreement that's placed before you actually the company writes that check. I'll give you an example. At the University of Maryland, when they built their new basketball arena. This was
Mhm.
after the team won the national title, and they had it cost $110 million to build the facility. 55 million was raised from Comcast, but here was the trick. every student that lived on campus had to subscribe to Comcast cable. Now, this was pre-Wi-Fi, of course, but and I don't know what the deal is if it's been restructured. But the point being is that that went on for infinity. So Comcast looked at it like they were going to get
Yeah,
that
but that's
55 million
that,
back
that's
eventually.
beyond naming rights, though. That's a separate. That's
But their name was on the
Yeah, I
facility.
mean that was probably, they came to Comcast and said, "We need help building the stadium. Will you invest?" And it was like, "This is what you'll get for your investment." The investment was in the actual stadium, not the naming rights of the stadium. The naming rights were just part of the deal. But most naming rights contracts don't work that way. They are
Right.
basically somebody paying for the right. And then, you look at any arena that changes its name. I remember the Boston Garden, and then it was before it was TD Bank North. It was something else before that. The Fleet Center. That's right.
Yes.
And Fleet got
That's right.
bought out, but it was the Fleet Center. And so, every time a company changed, they had to change the name of the stadium, but it was the name. They weren't taking over. Like you're talking about a contract that was between Comcast and the school to be able to finance the building of the facility, right? That's not
Right.
how most naming rights deals work. The
Good point.
stadium exists, probably had a name, and then somebody agreed, I will pay you money to put my name on top of it for the advertising. But that's the decision.
Yeah, that's a very smart point, actually, and you are right about that. So let's turn the page real quick on the Boston Celtics. They sold I believe it was a majority stake, I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, to a private equity firm for over $6 billion. Do you see that as a tipping point, though, for the private equity side? Because there's been so much money thrown in to the sports franchises. Do you think that maybe this was a jump the shark moment, or do you see the private equity world expanding its reach into sports businesses?
So, a couple of things to note. There's still a single person kind of leading the ownership group. It might have come. So to be clear, the Celtics were always owned by guys in PE. So the ownership of the Celtics previously, and the name Steve, what's his last name? I can't remember. Um,
Grisholm or something. I
no, that's not
forget.
who
But
I was
anyway,
thinking. It
doesn't
doesn't
matter.
matter. Those guys were from Bain.
Okay.
So they were Bain guys. They were private
Bang.
equity guys.
Yeah, Mitt
Um,
Romney's group. Yeah.
uh, But the point is that in sports, there's still got to be a guy. A private equity firm can't be making ownership decisions. It has to be like one person who that's their responsibility and ownership. The leagues kind of require that. So
Okay.
a private equity, I don't know the specifics of the Celtics transaction, and I really should. However, I feel pretty confident when I say this. It wasn't necessarily like an LP structure that bought that. It was more like a guy and a team from there as a GP buying it, but like one guy's in charge. I'm not convinced that it's within a GP LP kind of structure. Um, Most of the leagues have a cap on an LP driven investment because of the hoops that they require you jump through in order to get approved as an owner. Just because you got the money doesn't mean they'll approve you to buy the team. All the other owners have to vote on it. They ask questions like how, like they need somebody who's going to actually manage it and do something for it, right?
Okay.
So there's got to be somebody who they're going to put in charge. That's the guy. And so when I think about that, don't again. I haven't looked at the Celtics because it happened a while ago. It's the same time the Lakers deal happened. But ultimately, when you look at the Lakers deal or you look at the Dodgers, the ownership group is still led by like the one guy, even though
Mhm.
there's like a conglomerate. The Denver Broncos are another example of that.
Okay. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I want to ask you one final question before I let you go. So, as you know, the stories have been out there about sports gambling and with professional athletes, collegiate athletes as well. Do you think that from an alternative standpoint, there is ever going to be the welcome mat for PE firms or alternative investments to get into the business of sports gambling?
I mean, isn't DraftKings publicly traded?
Well, it is, but I guess my question would be, wouldn't there be some type of are there ESG policies? Is there something there that would prevent, say, an XYZ private equity firm to say, okay, we're going to
There is
invest this?
nothing that would prevent that. I would
Okay,
guess, this is my feeling, that the leagues would not look kindly on a private equity team that owns an, a team also owning a gambling facility. That would be
right,
problematic, but that would be a decision on the league level. My guess would be that that would make no sense whatsoever. I do think there's risk associated with something like that. The biggest risk to a lot of these franchises in these leagues, as we saw with the NBA, is sports gambling becoming such a massive part of it that like it's infiltrating how the teams are run, how the coaches manage games, and that's a risk to ownership that you have to consider when you're purchasing a team, is the risk of something like what just recently happened in the NBA happening associated with your franchise. Because that actually hurts the value of your team, right? It makes your team worth less, especially if they're gambling in a way that makes your team less competitive. But that's also strictly prohibited on the league level, right? That's not okay. That's why these people are, being investigated, going to jail, being banned. It's Pete Rose banned forever because you bet on your own team. Like that is just
right.
absolutely a non-starter. But in terms of private equity investing in like sports betting companies, like they're publicly traded. There's nothing that would stop them from doing it. That's just an investment decision.
Well, it does give you the impression that there's been such an influx of cash into sports franchises that perhaps the world of sports gambling is bringing on that exposure, bringing on that attractive investment from the PE alternative side. And I mean, we'll never know, but it just seems that for such a big jump to go from 6% 2 years ago up to 20% for billionaire family offices to jump into these
Well,
franchises,
to
there's
be
got to be a
fair,
huge.
that's because the rules changed.
Okay. Well,
So,
can you expand on that?
yeah, so, 2 years ago or a little over 18 months ago, the NFL was the last league that allowed PE to even make investments, right?
Right.
So, like 10 years ago, most leagues did not allow PE to invest at all. So, what the reflection you're showing is not a reflection of the interest was always there, it just wasn't possible. Now it's possible, which is why you're seeing the numbers rise. And it'll go up from here because now it's possible. And it's been 18 months since the NFL allowed it. So then it becomes the owners of those teams, putting opportunities out there to invest in. And so that doesn't happen overnight. As I mentioned when we started, it's a scarce resource. There's only so many, and there's only going to be so many opportunities at any time. But as more and more time goes past and more of those deal opportunities become, you'll see that number go further. The jump from 6% to 20% is more a reflection of could be done now or couldn't be done now can be done, and not more of oh, this is a sudden interest that didn't exist
Mm.
before. It just wasn't possible before.
Yeah, great comment. Great way to close out the segment as well. Shana, you are an expert at this. I love talking to you about it. We could talk all day, but I do have to cut off the show right now. And I do enjoy having you on. I do hope to have you back in the new year, though, Shana.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here. Always love to talk the business of sports.
Absolutely. So, on behalf of Shana Sissel, I am Todd Schoenberger. Thank you once again for joining me on the Money Path. We'll catch you next time. Take care.
Access real-time data and intelligent analytics exactly when you need them. Get the right data at the right time. Learn more at quotemedia.com.